Flint-like materials were made into assorted implements by striking a series of blows to detach flakes and shape the rock. In replicating these tools, a stone hammer can be used to drive off thick, wide flakes. Each blow is directed at a striking platform set along the edge in line with a ridge on the underside of the object. The flake follows and detaches from the ridge, leaving a depression scar and establishing new ridges on either side of the scar. As the work progresses, additional platforms and ridges are established for subsequent flake removal, and the object begins to assume its final shape. By 11,000 years ago, man began to use pressure flaking to make fine projectile points. A pressure tool with a semi-blunted tip was placed against an edge to press rather than strike off a flake. The technique was important because it gave early man better control over his tool making, and this is reflected in the variety of points used for hunting big game. Pressure flaking of early man points in the New World reached high levels of achievement. Most of these points were large and lanceolate in shape, and their parallel edges allowed the use of subtle flaking rhythms. Several pressure flaking techniques were widely used between 5,000 and 11,000 years ago in North America, and are being replicated here by Don Crabtree.
We use several techniques in producing this point. Will be a replica of a Paleo-Indian Frederick point. The artifact is first roughly flaked before the final flaking is done. The flakes are removed from both faces and both margins, sometimes several times. It's unfortunate we only have the last series of flake scars to examine the character of those scars. The flakes are also directed diagonally across the face of the artifact in order to remove all of the original material and cause the completed artifact to be straight.
Pressure flaking tools varied according to culture and special use. Keeping the tip of the pressure tool properly beveled required assorted whetstones, some of which have erroneously been called arrow shaft smoothers. Simple pressure tools of antler, bone, ivory, wood, or metal were used. Many flint-like rocks can be and were used for making stone tools. Among them are common opal from north-central Idaho, English flints, petrified wood, California chalcedony, northern Nevada chalcedony, and Texas flint. The glacier rocks require less force and are more suitable for pressure flaking, so obsidian and ignimbrite were widely used where they were available. Pressure flaking a primary flake to make a triangular corner-notched point looks random, but it's difficult to set up flaking rhythms for a triangular shape. The flaking is necessarily diagonal from both edges on both faces, so that the sides of the flake are reduced as one goes from the base to the tip and then from the tip to the base. One of several techniques may be used to notch the point. A split mammalian long bone is used here.
The material must be removed ahead of the flake to keep it from getting too thick. If it gets too thick and rounded, and one loses the angle, then the notch cannot proceed further.
The modern replica compares closely with the prehistoric point. Notching is started by removing each corner at the base and making a bevel on the fresh edge. To make the notch, a large flake must be detached from each face to remove the mass of material ahead of the proposed notch. If the inner edge of the notch is not kept thin, it will round off and halt the development of the notch. Small flakes are taken off to isolate a platform from which a large flake is pressed off toward the center of the point. Force is applied perpendicular to each face to prevent breaking off the stem. In this example, a copper tip, which requires less sharpening, has been substituted for the mammalian longbone.
The tool must be placed very carefully on the edge, not protruding beyond the face of the artifact. The artifact is rolled by holding the object between interlocking fingers and by pressing downward and rolling the hand at the same time. Both inward and outward pressure is exerted on the platform, thereby removing a flake directly underneath the left thumb. The object is turned and the same procedure repeated until the notch is of the required depth.
Collateral flaking is a characteristic of some early lanceolate points. Flakes are snapped off and allowed to expand, spreading over rather than along the ridges on the face of the object. Flake scars are perpendicular to the long axis of the point, feathering evenly at the midline on both faces. Force is applied primarily downward. Collateral flakes were sometimes widely spaced. This collateral flake specimen, called a Birch Creek point, was probably made about 10,500 years ago in the northern Rocky Mountains. Points of this type were used to hunt bison. A replica of the Birch Creek point is made by detaching small flakes from the margin. This frees part of the face near the edge and the point of the pressure flaker is set high on the edge above that spot. Force is applied downward suddenly to free the flake, leaving a small hollow on the edge. Flakes are freed quickly and feather at their margins because they are supported by the leather pad in the palm of the flint worker's hand. Diagonal parallel flaking depends on ridges. When a flake is removed from the underside of the point, shown enlarged here, a curved ridge remains, which must be straightened by detaching small flakes. The ridge will serve as a guide for removing the next flake. The removal of small flakes from the upper face isolates and aligns the platform with the ridge. The pressure flaking tool is seated on the minute platform, and pressure is exerted very gradually, first inward and then downward. The platform is carried away, leaving a sharp edge, while the flake carries across the midline of the face, ending just short of the opposite edge.
In order to remove a diagonal parallel flake, one must straighten the margin of the artifact so that the next platform may be placed directly opposite and in line with the groove left by the previous flake scar. First, one flake is removed, a very small flake. Then another. And finally a third. A flake now is removed from the opposite face to seat the tool. Then the tool is placed so that it is in direct alignment, and the force applied sufficiently to detach the flake, but the flake will not be removed until downward pressure is exerted and followed through. One examines the length of the flake carrying past the midsection or over the midline of the face, removing the long parallel flake. This flake scar will provide a ridge for the next flake to be detached. The same procedure will be used, realigning it again with the next flake scar and detaching another flake.
Straightens a curved edge left by the detachment of a previous large flake. The tool is pressed slowly and firmly onto the platform as pressure is exerted gradually inward and downward. The pressure tool is aligned with the ridge. The flake is freed from the face, first at the platform, and then along its length as downward force is applied. The tip of the pressure tool must be kept in line with the detaching flake in order to obtain the proper termination. If the platform collapses or the flake breaks off short in a hinge or step fracture, the next flake cannot be removed. In that case, the toolmaker must clear the step fracture by flaking from the opposite edge. In diagonal parallel pressure flaking, work must start at either the tip or the base and progress toward the opposite end. Each flake follows a ridge spaced so that each flake scar overlaps half of the preceding flake scar. The width of each flake is limited by the small flakes taken off to straighten the edge and align the platform with the ridge. These small scars cause the flake to detach at those points and limit its width throughout its length. Flakes can be carried past the midline if the preform is rolled slightly as each flake is detached. Lifting the replica shows a series of overlapping flakes, each of which is twice as wide as the flake scar remaining on the face of the artifact.
These are parallel, diagonal flakes. The edges are not crushed on the completed artifact, and they're extremely sharp and very serviceable implements. An examination of the flake scars shows the different styles of workmanship, spacing, the termination of the flakes, the depth of the bulbs of force, the hafting technique, the margins, the direction in which force was applied. This is diagonal, very closely spaced flaking, very sharp edges. This one shows a type of flaking representative of some of the Paleo-Indian styles of work. This is one of the flakes carrying from one margin to the opposite margin, curving over the edges. The artifact is turned in the hand as the flake is being removed, allowing the flake to travel from one edge to the opposite edge. As the flakes are more widely spaced, deeper bulbs of force. They terminate in the middle by overlapping. Widely spaced flakes terminating in the center, feathering out at the midsection. Such objects as these could be used as knives or lances.
An obsidian cobble is preformed for a proposed point by direct percussion flaking with a hammerstone. The blows are bold but well directed to remove the cortex. Shaping follows the long axis of the cobble to get the maximum use of material. Making a point on a large flake is more economical than shaping a core, but both techniques were used by prehistoric man.
You'll notice that blows are well directed. The intensity is changed depending on the amount of material to be broken. It is thinned, but not to the degree of thinness that the completed artifact will be. The thinning takes place around the margins on all faces. The stone is then abraded to strengthen the edge. This allows the blow to be directed without crushing the platform area and creating hinge fractures and leaving surplus material in the center or the midline of the object. The thumb is placed directly underneath the proposed flake, and a series of very specialized flakes are removed from along the margin. Sometimes more than one blow is required, but by grinding, it is so strengthened that fracture is not induced till a blow of the proper intensity is applied to the margin. The base must be secured to prevent end shock, because as one strikes on one end, quite often the opposite end will be removed simply from what is known as end shock. The edge of the hammerstone can be used for abrading and straightening the edges, but in order to take off uniform flakes from the margin, it must be made regular. The flakes are meeting in the center. They have a particular character that is identifiable, and one can, by examination of aboriginal flakes, can identify the thinning flakes. And many of them were taken off and removed with a great deal of precision.
These preforms are often found in caches and help to explain how prehistoric man kept good materials stored for future use. Smoothing turns and strengthens the edge for pressure flaking, the final step in the preparation of the preform. An Alberta point is replicated by collateral flaking with a composite pressure tool. The antler tip is set in a wooden handle whose length keeps the flint worker's forearm in line with his wrist and hand in the direction of the pressure. This tip is broad and is seated lower on the edge of the artifact than when a sharper tip is used. More of the edge is carried away as downward pressure is exerted. The flake is wide at the platform and has greater expansion than a collateral flake detached by a sharply pointed pressure flaking tool.
Grinding has also been used for pressure flaking to strengthen the edge. I'm using a very strong tool with a fairly broad point to remove large, wide, expanding flakes. The object is turned until both margins and both faces have been completely flaked.
By contrast, short, steep flakes are pressed from the margins of the base to create a stem or a shoulder, leaving the sharp, thin edges of the point unaltered.
Short, steep flakes are removed from the margin. To reduce the size of the stem, pressure is applied directly downward so that the flakes are not carried to the midsection and allowing the stem to be left as thick as the balance of the artifact. Grinding usually takes place to further strengthen it and prevent the cutting of the lashings as it's secured to a shaft or to a knife handle. This is a replica of an Alberta point. The stem was made very strong. The tip was rounded to provide greater strength rather than being very sharp. This is a cast of the original Alberta point that was used as a model for making the replica. We'll notice the wide collateral flakes directed directly in from the side, expanding and terminating at the center. The tool is well designed and well balanced, providing the user with a very fine implement.
Ancient projectile points were often used on spears for hunting bison and other big game. These points were probably related to the rapid expansion of human population in the New World. Later, smaller points were developed for the bow and arrow, and they represent the last step in a way of life that lasted nearly 2 million years.